Hey guys, it's Mel. Welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to do my first unhaul for 2020. So in my previous unhaul video, I'll link it below, I have talked to you about the fact that I have tended to be a person who has hung on to books, mostly because I used to have almost a fear of getting rid of books. It felt kind of almost sacrilegious to get rid of books, even if I didn't think I was planning on reading them again, or even if I had actually never gotten around to reading them, I would hang on to them for ages and ages. But recently I've come to the conclusion that that's probably slightly silly. So as I said in that previous video, it's mostly down to BookTube that I've come to this conclusion, because most people on BookTube seem to have come to terms with that as a concept and have decided that actually unhauling is a good thing to do. And I've decided that I agree. First of all, because it makes interesting content. Also, it makes room for new books on my bookshelves, which is always exciting. But also, is it really beneficial for a book to be sitting on my bookshelf not being enjoyed or appreciated, when I could take it to a secondhand bookstore or charity shop and actually have it be put out into the world again where someone might pick it up and read it? Well, really, it's better off going out to the world, I think. So, I'm doing another unhaul. This morning, now that I actually have a bunch of clear shelves, I did go into Book Depository and order a few more books. So when those come in, I'll be doing a book haul, which I'm really excited about. But before I show you the books, I just want to give you a little bit more background into why I'm unhauling these books. Like in my previous unhaul, some of these books are books that I actually want to replace with newer, prettier editions, particularly the classics. A couple of the books are books that just don't really kind of match up with what I'm reading anymore. And then the rest are just books that, frankly, I'm probably not going to reread. Let's just dive on into those books, shall we? The first one is The Almost Moon by Alice Sebold. To be honest with you, I don't really recall a huge amount about this book. I know that I thought it was quite good when I read it, but that was about 10 years ago, and I've never once thought to myself that I should reread it. So I think it's time for it to be unhauled. Alice Sebold wrote The Lovely Bones, which was turned into a movie, but this book is quite different from The Lovely Bones. It's a domestic thriller, and one of those stories that is kind of a family drama thriller with a lot of secrets that get revealed throughout the story. The next one is The Ladies in Black by Madeline St. John. You will probably recognize this from one of my book haul videos that I made in 2019. It is actually getting off the shelf really quickly for me. I did enjoy this book, but I honestly just don't know that I'm going to reread it, so it's better off going out and getting picked up by someone that will. This is an Australian story set in the 1950s, and it's about a group of women that work in a department store selling dresses. It's about their lives and their backstories and how they intertwine. And yeah, it's definitely a decent book, and I would recommend that you read it if you like that kind of chick lit. But I've read it now, so. Then we have The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. This is a book about Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table at Camelot. It is about Morgan Le Fay, and it is about all of the magic and drama surrounding that particular story of English history and mythology. I remember really enjoying this book, but again, that was probably about 15 or so years ago now, and in all that time that I've hung on to it, I've not reread it, so I think the honest truth is I probably won't. The next book is On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan. This is a book that I read last year for my Book Into Film Club and then subsequently watched the movie. It's definitely interesting and well written. Ian McEwan is a fantastic author. I really like the way that he describes his books and his characters. So I did enjoy this book, but again, it's not something that I can see myself reading again, certainly not anytime soon. It is about a young couple on their wedding night and how basically they fail to consummate their wedding, and that failure brings about all sorts of misunderstandings and misconnections that basically brings about the downfall of their relationship. In amongst that story, you also get their backstory of how they met each other and what their lives were like, and then it moves on to what their lives will be like. So if you like multiple timelines and flashbacks, if you like well-written English prose, if you like drama, you will like this book. I definitely think that it's worth a read, but like I said, I've read it now, so on it goes. The next book is The Girl with No Name by Pat Lowe. This is a middle grade Australian book. It's about a young boy and a young girl, one of whom is a white Australian and one of whom is an Australian Aboriginal. It's about their different cultures and them kind of learning about each other's culture. I remember this being somewhat problematic. I actually read it for a class at university when I did my undergraduate degree. So I read it as part of a course that I think was called something like Children in Fiction or something like that. So there were a lot of really interesting books that we read throughout that course, and this was one of them. But like I said, I remember it being somewhat problematic in terms of the way that it represented Australian Aboriginal culture. As you can probably tell, it's another one I haven't read for quite a long time, and despite the fact that it's moved a few times with me and so on, honestly, I'm not sure that I will read it again, and because of some of its problematic nature, I just don't think that it's a book that I will probably end up reading to any of the kids that I teach, so on it goes. And then we have 7 Little Australians by Ethel Turner. Similar to The Girl with No Name by Pat Lowe, this is a middle grade Australian children's book, and it is about 7 brothers and sisters growing up in Australia. They're European Australian children, and they grow up in sort of the outback of Australia. From what I can recall, again, this was a book that I read for that exact same class, and I remember it being a little problematic as well. And it's really just basically very out of date. I haven't seen any children reading it recently. I haven't seen it come up on the Australian curriculum at all. So honestly, I think it's time for it to be sent on as well. And now I want to show you some books that were written by an author that used to be my favourite author when I was in my late teens and early 20s. I still really like this author, but I haven't really read any of his books recently at all. The 3 books I'm about to show you are from 3 different series of his, and I don't own any of the other books, so it kind of seems pointless for them to be taking up shelf space. I figure that if I decide that I should rebuy these books, then I can certainly do so. But in the meantime, if I want to reread them, my mum has all of his books, so I can always borrow them off her. Anyway, that author is Stephen Lawhead, and the first one is Arthur, which is book 3 of the Pendragon cycle. The Pendragon cycle being a series of books about Arthur and Camelot. I remember them being really well written, really interesting historical fantasy books. And like I said, now that I'm talking about them, I may in fact borrow them off my mum and reread them. But given that I don't have any other of the books in this particular series, it does seem kind of pointless to own them. Then we have The Black Rood, also by Stephen Lawhead, and this is the Celtic Crusades book 2. So this is again about English history. Again, well written, interesting historical fiction that I really did enjoy at the time. Again, I can easily borrow off my mum, and I only have this book, so again, doesn't seem much point in keeping. And then Hood by Stephen R. Lawhead as well. This is actually the first in a series of books about Robin Hood, and so they're historical fictions as well. Again, I really enjoyed this book, but I didn't actually read any of the others in the series. I could very easily buy them, but I think that given this is quite an old copy, I might just borrow them off my mum and give them a read, see what I think, and then I might even buy them again. But this one, honestly, I think it's time for it to find a new home also. The next two books are also Stephen Lawhead books. So we have The Silver Hand and The Endless Knot. This is book 2 and book 3 in the Song of Albion trilogy. These books are about another world, which is Albion, which is basically the Celtic otherworld or the fairy world. So it's essentially kind of a legendary story of ancient Britain. I don't have the first book, and as you can see, these books just don't match up in terms of size and the look of them. They're quite old books. This was my favourite series of his, and this is the series that actually made me very interested in ancient history and then made me want to read, to study ancient history at university. So I think I will re-buy these books, but I'll buy newer versions and I'll buy the first one because that just makes sense. So these two can get sent off to a secondhand bookstore and someone else can read them in the interim. Next up we have 2 young adult fictions which I have again owned for a really long time, but not actually ever read. So it does seem somewhat pointless to own them. I think I picked them up in charity stores, op shops, thrift stores, and just thought they looked interesting, but then never got around to it. And since it's been probably about, like I said, 15 or so years, I see no point in continuing holding on to them. One is The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. So this book is a sci-fi book, and it is about a bunch of plants. Well, I think it's about an alien invasion, and the aliens are like giant plants. I don't really know much about this book, to be honest with you. So probably won't ever read it, and away it goes. And then we have The Guardians by John Christopher. It is a dystopian novel, a young adult novel, and that's basically all I know about it. And actually, now that I look at it, I may very well have read it, but it was probably about 25 years ago now, and I honestly have never, ever thought to reread it. So, and the last 4 books that I want to show you are classics, and I'm actually unhauling these because I intend, at some point throughout this year and next, to buy a bunch of the cloth-bound Penguin classics because I think they look absolutely beautiful and I just really want to own them. So I'm going to replace some of my classics with those. Not all of them necessarily. It depends on if they're classics that I actually think I'm going to read or reread. And the first of these is Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Oliver Twist is the story of a young orphan boy called Oliver who falls in with a group of orphan children who have been taken in by Fagin and turned into pickpockets. It is quite a dark story about children who are mistreated, and there's quite a lot of abuse and mistrust and abuse of power over children, so it's quite a dark story. I honestly don't know how I feel about Charles Dickens. I do like some of the content that he writes about, but I've never particularly warmed to his style of writing, and I've always found them a little bit of a slog to read through. So I'm not quite sure whether I'll end up replacing Oliver Twist or not. Then we have Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I feel like I probably don't need to explain what this one is about, since most people would have at least heard of Jane Eyre. I really like Jane Eyre. This particular copy, there's nothing really wrong with it. It's not super old, but like I said, I just really like some of the cloth-bound classics. I think they're really pretty, and I'd like to get a version of that. Then we have The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. And same again, I like this story. I think I'd like a pretty version or edition of it. So Tom Sawyer is an adventure story about a young boy, Tom, and it is, it's kind of in the same vein as something like The Famous Five by Enid Blyton, except that it's an American adventure story. And It's a lot of fun, it's great to read, and again, I'd like a nice pretty version. And lastly, we have Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. And exactly the same as the last 3 books that I just talked about. This is a classic, it's a children's classic. I love Peter Pan. I think it's absolutely beautiful. It's about Peter, who's a young boy that will never grow up, who lives in Neverland with the Lost Boys, who are a bunch of orphans that have been taken into Neverland by Peter and who will also never grow up. It's about his adventures in Neverland, and it's also about the Darling children who Peter takes off to Neverland and have big adventures. But it's about a lot more than that. It's about family, it's about friendship, it's about connection, and it's just a beautiful story. And again, I know there's a beautiful version out there which I'd really like to own. Talking about those 4 classics made me think of 2 more classics that I really, really like, but think that maybe I'd like to buy the pretty versions of as well. And the first of those is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and then My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. So these 2 books are both gothic mystery thriller novels. They are quite different, although I actually haven't read Rebecca in a long time, so I don't really recall a huge amount about Rebecca. I know that it's similar in some ways to Jane Eyre. So it's about a woman who is married to a much older and much more higher up the class list, for want of a better way of putting it, and is married to this man, and a man who's also a lot older than her, and discovers that there is a previous wife in the mists of time somewhere. In this case, the wife doesn't actually still live, but the young woman gets completely obsessed with the previous wife, and there's a lot of mystery and thriller involved in the story. And this one, My Cousin Rachel, is again another gothic thriller. It is about a woman, Rachel, who marries a man, but then that man dies, but it seems very suspicious, and the people in that man's life, including his cousin Philip, become very suspicious of Rachel and what her potential role in Ambrose's death was. So sort of, I guess, similar to Rebecca and Jane Eyre, but quite different as well. So that was my unhaul for the first part of 2020. Please comment below if you have any books that you're hauling or unhauling. If you have read and liked any of these books, or that any of these books on this list that you didn't like, I'd love to chat with you about that in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to my channel, and I'll see you next time.